Okay, welcome. Today I wanted to talk about the symptoms of trauma. So, if we've had a trauma as a child or as an adult, what are some of the symptoms that manifest in the body psychologically and emotionally? And I just wanted to talk through really Peter Levine's book, Healing Trauma, and some of what he puts in. So this is more of a generic, what are some of the symptoms that might show up, and they might be showing up in your life now, and you might be going, oh, right, did something happen to me as a child that I'm still carrying the effects? The symptoms which are showing up in my life are because of that trauma. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm basically drawing a lot from Peter Levine's book, Healing Trauma, today. And so it's quite a small book. I mean, he's got these 12 steps. And if you look on the back here, it just says unexplained symptoms. It could be past trauma. So, for example, often Joy Shavrin talks about this in her book, Boarding School Syndrome, that people would present to her, or, people coming to different psychotherapists who are just general psychotherapists, and they'll come for a presenting reason. Maybe it's their relationships breaking down, or there's depression. And what Joy Shavrin often found was underneath that was some form of childhood trauma. And in her work, what she found often was there was a boarding school element. She might have been seeing someone for a few months, and then it would come out. This was in the beginning. Oh yeah, I went to boarding school. So, it might be that you have some of these presenting symptoms. Now, what Peter Levine points out, and it's important to note, that just because you have some of these symptoms doesn't mean you had some form of childhood trauma. For example, some of the symptoms in here, flu-like symptoms. You have things like constriction, which he talks about here. But the difference with something like flu or an illness, it lasts for a few days and then it dissipates. Whereas something like trauma, it's often there, especially at a trigger point. And I often find this in the work I do with clients one-to-one, is that it will be, say, with a certain person. It might be your parents, or it might be at a certain time. So in my work with ex-boarders, going away on a trip or coming back home when you've been away, these can be trigger points. You might get very anxious, and what it means is that underneath that symptom could be the cause. It could be trauma. So what I wanted to just talk about now is just a list of them. So the first one he links and lists is hyperarousal. So often when we've had some form of trauma, and this can often be just after the trauma. It might be a car accident, or you might have had some form of injury. You've got this hyperarousal. And the idea here is that, it might be repetitive thoughts. It might be thinking about things. What I found in my own work is, and in my own life, I think I mentioned 2 months ago, I was interviewed by a national newspaper. The day after, I felt this hyperarousal. The mind was just going. It was like, what's this? And I realized, oh yeah, from school, from my childhood, you don't speak up was one of the core beliefs. You don't say anything about anybody. And so that for me is like, I can work through that and heal that. So the second thing he talks about is constriction. They say this: when we're in fear, our blood flows to our extremities, allowing us to fight and flight. So often when we've had this trauma, we have this constriction, and our digestion shuts down. We become more tense and wary. And again, it's a positive thing in the short term. And if you, as Peter Levine talks about more in his other book about trauma, Waking the Tiger, saying that animals, they have that fight or flight, and then afterwards they shake, they release it. Often for us as humans, we don't release this. So the constriction can be a positive, but if we don't then release that tension, then that can cause illnesses or problems later on. Another thing with trauma, another symptom is dissociation, denial. So Joy Chavarin, work with boarding school syndrome, A, B, C, D. The D is dissociation. He talks about in here this idea of Woody Allen saying, I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And he says that's typical dissociation. And a lot of us, when we, maybe you're in a relationship with someone and they dissociate. It's like you ask them what they feel and they've no idea. Or they say they feel something, but you're like, really? We often see this in the UK, and reading Nick Duffell's book, Wounded Leaders today, this idea that there's a lack of empathy, there's a dissociation. So it's like, do you not feel what that person's feeling? So that's very the key. And he talks about denial being a lesser form of dissociation. Oh, I'm fine. Because we just don't want to look there. So that's often a sign, right, some traumas happened in my earlier life. Another thing, one of the key symptoms he talks about is feelings of helplessness, immobility, and freezing. So you've got the fight, flight, and freeze response. So the freeze is another, it might be certain situations you freeze. For me, when I wanted to step out into the world, do this work, it was only after I'd released my trauma that I could do it. Before, I just used to freeze. And I just couldn't do anything. And I might have thought, it's just me, something wrong with me. But actually, in realizing that, unexplained symptoms, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep sabotaging myself? It could be past trauma. And for me, it was. So some of the other, and he gives a list. I'll just go through and list some of these. And obviously, like he says, it doesn't necessarily mean it's trauma, but these are key symptoms linked in together. And often I will be contacted, I have on my website a list of key symptoms of boarding school syndrome, and especially questions to ask. And a lot of boarders contact me and they go, I said yes to every single question. And there's 20 questions there. So you might find that as you read through this, listen to this, it's like, oh my God, yeah, I can resonate. So hypervigilance, you're being on guard all the time. That's one of them. Intrusive imagery or flashbacks. Pete Walker in his book, Complex PTSD, talks about this a lot, flashbacks. A lot of the clients, ex-boarders I've worked with, they have had flashbacks. Extreme sensitivity to light and sound. And you might find, that's not true, but then when you're tired or you've been triggered, then it's like, oh yeah, I can't stand light or sound. Hyperactivity, again, it might be you're fine in certain instances, but you're triggered in certain points and you go into hyperactivity. Exaggerated emotional and startle responses. So looking at wounded leaders in, I think it was David Cameron in Parliament one time, a lady politician criticised him and he had a big outburst of anger. I wouldn't say big, but it was like everyone was kind of shocked by it. So it was like exaggerated emotional startle response. It's like, okay, what happened earlier? And then, so nightmares and night terrors, it's common. Difficulty sleeping is another common trait. abrupt mood swings, rage reaction or temper tantrums, frequent anger or crying. Again, that's symptoms of trauma. Shame and lack of self-worth. Reduced ability to deal with stress, easily and frequently stressed out. Okay, so what he's saying in this book is that these symptoms, they may show up immediately, at boarding school or in your childhood. You've had this trauma and you might become an anxious person. But I'll be honest, with the people I've worked with, they often leave school and they're very high functioning, especially the ex-boarder crowd. Very high functioning. They will, I've worked with people who have been top in the field in banking or maybe in media, and then suddenly something will happen. Maybe it's the death of a family member or loss of a relationship, and then these symptoms, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks, suddenly they come back. And that's often the sign of a trauma, especially a childhood trauma. So some of the other ones he talks about: panic attacks, anxiety, phobias, mental blankness, spaced out feelings, avoidance behavior, avoiding places, activities, movements, memories, or people, attraction to dangerous situations. Okay, now I know quite a lot of clients that I've worked with over the years, who've had childhood trauma, love extreme sports. Attraction, addictive behaviors, overeating, drinking, smoking, exaggerated or diminished sexual activity, amnesia and forgetfulness, inability to love, nurture or bond with other individuals, fear of dying or having a shortened life, self-mutilation, severe abuse, self-inflicted cutting. And this was something I had in my 20s. It just came out of nowhere, but this self-hatred I had for myself was like triggered. I was fine until that point. So Judith Herman, in her book Trauma and Recovery, who's a psychiatrist, she talks about that it's often in the 4th and 5th decade when the trauma starts to arrive. She might have even said the 3rd, but I think the 4th and 5th, when some of these traumas kind of come to the surface. And he also talks about in this book, and I realize this is a longer video, I think it's important to just to go through. And the next list that he gives here is a list that it takes a lot longer to manifest. So it might be like Judith Herman talking, your 4th, your 5th decade, that it starts to manifest. And what he talks about is excessive shyness, diminished emotional responses, inability to make commitments, chronic fatigue, very low physical energy. Again, I had chronic fatigue in my 20s, around the same time with the self-harming. Immune system problems, certain endocrine problems such as thyroid malfunction, environmental sensitivities, psychosomatic illness, particularly headaches, migraines, neck and back problems, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, asthma, skin disorders, digestive problems, and severe premenstrual syndrome, depression and feelings of impending doom, feelings of detachment, alienation and isolation, the living dead feelings. Now that's kind of really, for me, boarding school and often childhood trauma. If we've been in a household where you weren't allowed to feel too much, or you couldn't be too down, come this shutdown. And that for me is boarding school. You can't be too up and you can't be too down. It's like this living dead. I call it the zombie. And reduced ability to formulate plans. So those are just some of the symptoms. So it might be you listen to this and you go yes to everything. Well, it might be you don't. Maybe you don't resonate. Maybe you haven't had childhood trauma. What this just helps you to see is that sometimes, especially if you've had something happen 0 to 6, you can't remember it, but if you've got the presenting symptoms, it's like, I can therefore work with that. I was working with someone today, on an incubator memory. So we can work on really early memories. I think this is important to say is, if we can't remember them now, but we've got the presenting symptom, we still can do some healing about it. Because remember, what do you feel in your body? Yeah, I can just, what I use is the tapping EFT, which has been amazing. So yeah, a longer video today, and also to note that on Friday I have my latest podcast going live, which was with a fascinating guy, Sean Chamberlain. He has worked with, I've forgotten his name, a leading about ecology, the environment, climate crisis, just about what he feels we're moving into. And yeah, he's sort of published certain books. And yeah, that's something we'll be exploring this Friday. So that will go live. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. Any questions, please let me know. Blessings.